All right, we are recording. Mike Stroh, welcome to the Conquering Everest podcast.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks for being here. This is awesome.
Yeah, glad to have you. Got your bio, and we had a little chat before, and I think you've got a really good story that would resonate with a lot of folks. But before we get into that, would you like to take just a few moments and introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, so my name is Mike Stroh, kind of like the Stroh's beer that I know is popular in the U.S., or at least it was at one point when I was trying to trace my family lineage to get money somehow.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, in my delusional states, which I'm sure we'll get into. Anyhow, so yeah, my name's Mike Stroh, and I'm a psychotherapist and the founder of a mental health consultancy that specializes in K-12 education and workplace mental health. And the name of that consultancy is Starts With Me. And over the years, we've kind of worked with some really big brands like Amazon and Hyundai, the city of Toronto, and a lot of sort of the bigger school boards in the province. But of course, since the province is the biggest province/state in the country, so some of the biggest school boards in the country. And the organization was really born out of my personal and family experience with mental illness, addiction, recovery as a caregiver to my brother who lives with schizophrenia. And so it's sort of been a labor of love and turned into almost a career.
Yeah, it's amazing how suffering and the events of our life can really shape the future and what we can do that we probably never expected to do. You mentioned province, so you are Ontario, Canada, correct? Is that
That's
where
correct,
you're
yeah.
located? Okay,
Yeah.
So anybody that not used to that terminology, Mike is coming to us from Ontario, Canada. So you talked a little bit about how it sounds like you got into the line of work you're in due to some mental illness, and you said you had a brother with schizophrenia. Let's talk a little bit about your brother in that. I mean, has that been a lifelong battle for him, or is it something that started later on down the road?
Yeah, I think it's sort of hard to know. I'd say when he was around, I mean, we both did a lot of drugs from a really young age. So it's hard to distinguish how much of it was sort of the drug use and how much of it was just the inevitable kind of genetic makeup of who we are. So I was around 14, 15, 16. So he would have been, I guess, 16, 17, 18, something like that. He was exhibiting what we would call early warning signs of symptoms and behaviors that were clearly, I guess, signposts that something was not right. And those are typically delusions or thinking things that are, to most people, not logical or not real even. And then so he was a little bit just kind of off, but maybe it was just kind of normal teenage stuff or whatever. And then I'd say he had his first real kind of psychotic break. I think he was about 21, 22, I think. So I think I was in my first year of university at that time. Yeah, and I mean, it's quite a shock when something like that happens. You're never kind of ready for it. And
Right.
This was how many years ago? About 20 years ago, in which our collective understanding of mental illness, and particularly schizophrenia, was certainly outdated or just not as enlightened, I guess you could say.
What you talked about, there were some red flags, early warning signs. What are some of those for those of us that may not be real familiar with that disability?
Yeah. So primarily, I guess I'll just describe. So generally speaking, schizophrenia is a diagnosis that consists of psychosis. And really what that means is people have hallucinations, and the hallucinations are through the senses, right? So it's seeing things that other people don't see, hearing things that other people don't hear, feeling things, and so through the senses. And I'd say most primarily it's auditory hallucinations. So that's why often I think the most common thing is people hearing voices, right? Or talking back to voices that aren't there. So he would describe these stories, these just outlandish stories that seem so far from reality. And they got increasingly more distorted and more unbelievable over time. And generally, and so those are kind of considered delusions. And I think they just got more and more weird and more weird and more severe. And then it kind of gets to a point where, the person's like fully in a psychosis in which everything going on around them is totally disconnected from reality, or from the consensus reality outside of them.
Yeah. I don't know if we talked about it the first time, our initial conversation, but is your brother still with us?
Mm-hmm.
Is he doing better now, or?
Yeah, and I mean, it is a reasonable question or legitimate question, because a lot of people with schizophrenia, I guess their life expectancy is greatly reduced. And I'd say often it's the case if people have supportive families or loved ones, they have a much better chance at kind of making it through. So fortunately he is. He lives with my mom. I guess he's been pretty well for the last 10 years. So it was about 10 or so years that were really rough. And so, in and out of jail, in and out of hospital, in and out of it was just insane. So now he's pretty good. Of course, he's got some barriers to, I guess, living a good life, but for the most part, he's pretty good. He plays hockey and he works almost full time, and he's got a small kind of network of friends. And so that's almost, that's a good outcome, I would say, for someone in his situation, considering everything he's been through. And I guess to another point to your question is my grandfather, so my dad's dad, died by suicide, actually. So it's hard to know. They think he was probably bipolar. Maybe he did have some sort of schizophrenic experiences, but he had a lobotomy, which is like basically when they cut your brain open and try to cut out the part of your brain they think is sick, right? Yeah. And I think shortly after that he killed himself. So that's a good example of how far we've come, and maybe also a door that's open for how far or how much room there is to continue improving how we care for people.
Yeah, I had done, I kind of read up a while back on the old school way of handling mental health issues, and the lobotomy. I think, the last one that was performed was 60s or 70s. So that's not, I mean, you're talking, 2020. So, doing my math, what's that, 60 years ago, that, it wasn't too long ago where they were experimenting on the brain to see what what would work and what wouldn't. You talked about you and your brother struggled with addiction from an early age. What do you think, or do you know, what was the contributing factor to your kind of going down that path to drugs, alcohol, whatever your addiction was around?
Yeah, it is the description you could say would be, our parents divorced. I was pretty young. I was about 5 or 6 when they divorced. Mm-hmm. My mom worked a lot. I think she was sort of one of the early, female people who were kind of trying to but advance in executive realms or whatever it is.
Right.
And the reason I say that is because she like we didn't see her very much. So we spent most of our time living with her. And so we'd be in daycare from day till night kind of thing. So we didn't have, I guess the point is we didn't have much supervision. And I think the inherent genetic makeup, and on my mom's side, there's a lot of alcoholism and et cetera. So it's in our blood, no doubt. And we're predisposed, as they would say. And I personally, I'll speak for myself. I'm a stubborn person, maybe not so much anymore, but I was kind of a stubborn kid, I guess you could say, and very curious. And so I had a pretty unique experience where at 12 years old, I went on a field trip to Chicago with my school and thought it was a great idea to bring magic mushrooms with me.
Okay.
And of course, my brilliant brother thought it was a good idea to give them to me at 12 years old. I'd never been high, never been drunk. And I had, I think, what I can only describe as a drug-induced sort of psychosis. I didn't even have pubic hair at the time, I don't think, and so it was a disaster, but it was a clear example of somebody who was destined to live with addiction. So after it happened, I kind of had, it took a few days for me to kind of come back to earth. And the narrative in my head was that was the most horrendous thing I've ever experienced, but I want to do it again. I just don't want it to be that bad. It was the first time I ever felt that I had control over how I felt in some sense. So I was anxious for sure. And who knows what other kind of mental health conditions. It's really hard to kind of, I definitely have I have ADHD now, no doubt. I probably had it then. I was just looking for something to have a sense of control over how I felt. And of course, substances give you the illusion that you do have control. Right. And temporary relief, long-term pain.
Yeah. It's kind of crazy to think because there's talks now, like I've been reading in the news where they're looking at mushrooms as, psychedelic mushrooms as a potential for medicinal purposes, kind of like cannabis. Cannabis went to a medical grade, and and when I was growing up, magic mushrooms, that was I had never partook in any of them, but they were definitely around, and it was a way that people would have a trip. And so it's kind of hard to believe that, they're talking about using it in a healing way. But maybe, I guess we'll see how that shakes out. So you guys, you got involved with drugs, alcohol, young age, and that continued on for how long for you? When did you finally kind of go, okay, I need to get some help here?
I just want to mention about the sort of medicinal use of the mushrooms and those kind of psychedelics. Just, I think what's great about that in some sense is that they can be positive experiences for people. Of course, not for a 12-year-old, but
right.
And they're done in super controlled environments, like under strict clinical conditions and et cetera. I've been following that research a bit, and I do think if it can help people, that's amazing, right? Because the pharmaceutical industry has been and continues to try to create solutions for people, but it's not always going to work. So I think if it's done ethically and so on and so forth, and I'm all for it. I'm definitely not against that. And I think we'll see, kind of like you said, time will tell about, how it all plays out. That's just been on my mind lately. So as you brought it up, I couldn't help but thought.
It's definitely interesting to see where that may be going.
Yeah. And so to answer the other question, I think, so shortly after that, I started experimenting with cannabis or weed, and that worked for me. sort of, I'll never forget the first time I got high, I thought to myself, wow, this is what I've been searching for my whole life in some sense. That instant relief, the instant sense of euphoria. And I very much relate to this idea of a lot of substance use or behavior addictions. I think the intention is a search for wholeness or a search for greater something, a connection to something. And drugs and alcohol do that so instantly. And so that's what I got from that, I think. And then probably by the age of 13, 14, I was selling drugs and I was high 24 hours a day, literally. Just, I got convicted of trafficking cannabis in grade 11. And a good description of addiction is sort of the person has some sort of internal pain or trauma and tries to soothe that trauma with the substances. And no matter what the negative consequences of that behavior are, they can't stop, no matter how much they want to. And that was for sure me. I had a girlfriend from around 15 years old telling me I wasn't myself anymore. Things were not good. And I knew that, but I could not ever, I couldn't open myself up to that. I couldn't allow myself to be vulnerable or something like that. And in thinking about this idea of conquering Everest, that I've been thinking about that in some sense. And so I scraped through high school. I kind of cheated my way through high school. I scraped my way through university, and I did even cheat at the end of university because I was such a mess that I didn't know what to do. And I squeaked through university. Then I had a cool job that was seasonal, producing concerts for a big festival, but I could never, because I needed to be high all the time and I couldn't pursue a meaningful job. I couldn't be committed to certain things. Then I found online poker, which for somebody like me was a gift and a curse, because I could hide from the world behind my computer screen. I made a lot of money. I was very successful, but I also was feeding my addiction at the same time and continuing to isolate. And at some point I knew it wasn't like I was really getting sick, spiritually, mentally, physically. And so the last straw, I sort of convinced another person and myself it was a good idea to get married, somehow kind of hiding as much as I could of the reality of my situation. And then, so shortly after getting married at 30, so this high 24/7, basically until I was 30. And that one, after getting married and reality setting in, sort of the house of cards or the house of lies that I'd been telling myself for so long just kind of started to crumble. And I was getting scared of where my thoughts were taking me and where my reality, it just sort of, it was like I was sinking in a pit of sand. And it was like, this is not going to turn out well very fast if I don't ask for help. And so I did. I called a friend of mine who, I think you and I are probably around the same age. And this guy I used to rave with back in the 90s and stuff. So I knew, and he was an addiction counselor at a treatment center. And so I said, wow, if that guy can get better, then I might have a chance. And I called him and he was really helpful. And I'll never forget the day where I called the hospital to check myself into this treatment program. Two parts about that. I haven't thought about this in a while. The person on the phone said, well, okay, Michael, if you come, you got to be sober for 72 hours before you come. Of course, well,
easier said than done, right?
Exactly. It's like, if I could be sober for that long, I wouldn't be calling you. And then right after that, he was with me and he gave me a big hug and just said, it doesn't have to be like this anymore. And I just remember melting, or what felt like I was melting, And I don't remember if it was in the hug or after or whatever, and I kind of just let go and I started crying, and it was just such a moment of relief.
Yeah.
Because for years I told myself I was going to stop, I should stop, I need to stop, blah, 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 blah. But it never was a reality till that moment. And that's when everything started to change. It was about 10 years ago.
Yeah, I think, that I can, I always say this. I say this with everybody I have a conversation with, but I can relate on so many levels to what you've been through. And when you talk about finally being able to just accept you can get better, I think for all of us, those moments come where, for whatever reason, we can't seem to give ourselves permission to heal. But then when somebody tells us, hey, it's going to be okay, and you get that hug, or somebody says you're forgiven, it's like, oh, like I've had those moments where it's just like, that was the most important thing I needed at that point. Talk a little bit about cannabis, since that seemed to be one of your drugs of choice. So it is used medicinally now. At least here in the United States, it's starting to be legalized recreationally. And here where I'm at in Illinois, it is you can go buy recreational cannabis. And from what I've been able to gather, there's not much difference between the medicinal, or maybe there's no difference between the medicinal cannabis and the recreational cannabis. So if the potencies are, if there's really no, the only difference I see is that if you have a medical card, then you could grow it, you can have more of it, you get a discount on it. But what's your opinions on cannabis as a medicinal use product?
Yeah. And thanks for, as you were reminding or reflecting on that idea of, I can't remember exactly what you said, but about allowing ourselves, or
giving ourselves permission.
Yeah. That, I got a sort of, the tingles, because there is something so, it's ineffable, is that the word? Or it's so hard to describe how that happens, or how we go from one to the other. But just when you were saying that, it was so nice to be reminded of that's what kind of a big part of healing, even to this day, in some sense. So thanks for that. And then the cannabis, so for my own purposes of healing, I have no opinion one way or the other on it. I think what I do know, and I've done a bit of work with treatment centers here, and what I know that the medical doctors who are responsible, and I'm sure it's similar here than in the US, but I'm sure there's also the differences. There's no thorough science data. They don't know what they're doing, really. And I've heard doctors say that openly. We're now in a position where we're told we can prescribe cannabis, but we have no fucking idea what, and if you go into a bodega or whatever they're called and say, I want, the guy or the girl on the counter will say, we got sativa for this and indica, blah, blah, blah. And they say it's good for anxiety, it's good for this. There's a morsel of truth or reasonable understanding of what's going on. But beyond that, nobody knows what they're talking about, no matter how much they try to pretend they do. So I just wish it was more honest in that sense. And I, like you pointed out too, that what's the difference between the medicinal, recreational, who knows? But I do know that one good thing about legalization might be the ability to know what you're giving people more clearly. And then I do also know you can reduce, I think it's the THC and the CBD. I think those are the two main psychoactive, or the THC is the psychoactive, the CBD is the antipsychotic one, actually. And what's happened is we've bred out the CBD, but they've bred out the antipsychotic components of the cannabis, which is why it's so potent and powerful. It is a hallucinogenic as well, which is not often discussed. But anyhow, so I think prohibition is a disaster. I think so many social issues in the United States are caused by the war on drugs and sort of how that impacts different communities. And so I try to stay out of the politics of it all, but I think legalization is inevitable, and it's actually the right thing to do. I think it just doesn't make sense to be arresting people for getting high. I mean, if they commit a crime as a result of being high or drunk, then they should be punished or held accountable. But there's such a weird paradox, because America is the reason why historically democracies have thrived, I think, and that push for freedom and liberty and don't tell me what to do, that's beautiful. But then at the same time, there's this sense moral superiority that we all have it in some sense, but it's very, very, I don't know, overt in the U.S., especially around drugs. So,
yeah. And I agree. With your perspective on the legal ramifications. And one thing in the United States is you could come to Illinois and buy it, or there's several states now you can buy it legally, but right. if you travel across the border to a neighboring state, that it could be a felony. Like you could right. literally go to prison for having an eighth of cannabis with you. And so I think there definitely is there's a lot of room to grow. I also think with cannabis too, if for some people, and I've used it for a means of controlling anxiety, mm-hmm. but like in times that I've used it, knowing that I do have an addictive personality as well, because that runs in the family on different sides. I'm actually on both sides of my family, but using it alone in your own space as a means to relax versus going out and celebrating and using it as a means of socializing, I think the effects. I'm no expert, but the effects can be different, depending on how you use it. So yeah, I'm on that border too, where it's like, do you allow it? Do you not? I mean, alcohol's legal, right? So, yeah. And that could do more damage. If I drink because of, my illness with depression and anxiety, if I drink, it worsens. It doesn't get better. But if I partake in cannabis, it mellows. But anyways, it's interesting. That's a story for another day, I guess, because cannabis, that could be a whole episode in itself. But
good.
So when did you decide that? Because it sounds like you were going through, high school, you went through university, and you were still addicted. When did you decide to get into the profession that you're in now? Was it? I'm assuming it was probably after you got help, but maybe not.
Yeah. So I'd say one piece, which actually I think contributes to the addictive personality or whatever tendency, is a longing for connection to something greater than yourself, or just something that's meaningful.
Yeah.
And I think I certainly had that inclination, and I was desperate I wanted to be part of the world. I wanted to engage in meaningful conversations and so on and so forth. I didn't know how. So I think I always had that yearning in some sense. And so I'd say when I sobered up or got cleaned up, whatever, I was playing poker still. Mm. And because it was the only thing I knew how to do. I was 30 and I certainly wasn't really employable. I continued to play for about 3 years, right up until our second child was born. And at that point, I started getting involved in youth mental health education through personal experience storytelling with the largest mental health hospital in Canada, which delivers this really awesome youth mental health program. So at that point, I my wife and I had built a business that was starting to sustain our income, and I never wanted to be a poker player, really. I mean, it was fun, and I got to spend lots of time in Vegas and do this and that, but it just, it wasn't what I wanted. And I saw an opportunity, or what I thought was an opportunity, to help make youth mental health education more interesting for young people, more engaging, quote unquote, cooler. And I did have, the one job I really ever had was festival production and music management. And I thought, I'm going to build a youth mental health festival. And having no idea what I was doing, and so I set out on that mission. A few years later, it came to reality. I wasn't really making money doing it, but it had some legs to it. And then I started being asked to speak in different places and do workshops and stuff. And then I kind of had a conversation with my wife, and it was, okay, our business is sustaining us, although you still need to have an income in some sense. You can't just live in fantasy land forever. And so I agreed, and I said, okay, well, I'm going to go back to school. And I decided to go back to school to get a master's in counseling psychology so that I could have a backup plan if the mental health consultancy stuff didn't pan out. And so I graduated in October of 2020. And now I have a split kind of job of part-time psychotherapist, part-time mental health consultant, speaker. And so it's working.
Yeah.
It's happening. It's, of course, not linear, never what you think it's going to be, but it's been amazing. I think, as I said before, I'm stubborn. I think part of being high your whole life, and particularly something about that mushroom experience when I was so young, my mind was blasted wide open. So my interests in the world, part of me thinks I would be interested in almost any job. So I have a tree being cut down in my backyard right now. I'm watching these guys climb up the tree. I mean, it's so fascinating and cool and interesting. And I love so part of me is like, ooh, I could be a tree cutter, So that's actually quite difficult to deal with. And that's part of the ADHD symptoms, I guess you could say. So I'm kind of rambling on a bit, but I'm enjoying what I'm doing. I'm not a business person. I have a hard time with schedules and with being organized and that kind of stuff. And so that has been a challenge for me and continues to be. But I'm at a place finally. I'm 40 in October. I think I can call myself an adult now, something like that, quote unquote. And I'm learning to be, I guess, the person I always wanted to be. Something like that. Yeah.
Two things very different, contrasting questions or topics here. It kind of thinking back to your playing poker, being a poker player. Have you, to me, at least for the folks that I talk to, drug, alcohol addiction goes hand in hand with a lot of people. It seems like at one point, when they're trying to get away from the drugs and alcohol, they turn to gambling as a way to get that rush and that high. I did that as well, not with poker, but when I got over my through my cycle of depression and anxiety, I no longer had a means to mask it or try to suppress it. So I ended up playing, you can go to any gas station around here and they've got slots. And so I video game machines, whatever they're called nowadays. And I win some, lose some. I've got that back under control, but it's kind of fascinating how a lot of people that I've talked to, that's that's kind of where they went with, after when they were in recovery. Do you see that a lot with folks, or is that just, it just dependent on the person, the personality? But
Yeah, I think so. One, for sure, I think it depends on the person, the situation, etc.
yeah.
I think it is so tricky, and that's why this, even as a therapist or as a person in recovery, there's no one size fits all. I do think that there is an underlying reality that for most people, certain behaviors, no matter how they manifest, are not healthy.
Yeah.
And I'd say for me in poker, I do remember gambling a lot in high school on football. And I remember the terror of not feeling in control of the outcome.
Yeah.
Torture. And
Right.
so then and that's why I think cannabis addiction is so insidious, is that it doesn't knock you out like alcohol and other drugs does in most cases. So you have this illusion or delusion that you're in control. And so there's that piece, but with poker, and it's the same thing. If I put $1 in a slot machine, or I play roulette or something, the terror that I experience from lack of control is horrible. So what's nice about, and I know those games are set up for me to lose. Like, you actually cannot win. That is something that you have to, and my son now, he always wants to bet on everything. I'm very, because that's a hard one at gambling. And so with poker, you're not playing against the house, number one, or at least you shouldn't play poker if you are playing against the house. You want to play against other human beings. The house takes a rake, of course, but the good thing about poker, for me at least, was it was the only thing I could do right when I was so fucked up. And I knew if I made the right mathematical bets consistently over time to the best of my ability, that I would make money. And that's where I think poker is distinctly different than other forms of gambling. Like, I would say poker isn't necessarily gambling, except for certain people who are not playing it as sort of theoretically as you could. And you see the most successful poker players, although maybe historically have not been this way, but they're really nerdy, they're really smart, and they take the mathematics very seriously, and they win a lot. So that's where I could never get to that level, because I was fucked up for most of the time, and then the end of the career I was just doing it to pay the bills. But anyway, that's a bit of a side note on the gambling. But I think it's about self-honesty is the big thing. Like you said, it was a problem for you in some sense, and so for certain people, I think it's all about rigorous honesty to the best of your ability, and having feedback from somebody else. So one thing I didn't mention, like, I went to 12-step meetings almost every day for a few years. I got a sponsor. I went through the steps. My sponsor is probably my best friend today. Same sponsor, same program, if you will. I have a psychiatrist. I have a therapist. Well, now they are the same, but I used to have two different. I had marriage counseling. I had a mindfulness therapist, group mindfulness psychotherapy, who's a medical doctor. So I got my filthy hands on everything I possibly could to help myself. And I think that's a message that I think is important to tell, is like, I did not do any of this on my own by any stretch. So
you always have to have those people in your corner that are looking out for you. So I had a second question that's kind of filtered away in my brain, but I do want to take some time and make sure that we talk about your website, what you have available. If there's somebody, that's listening to this and they're like, hey, I'm there with you. I'm addicted, or I was addicted. I'm losing control, what let's talk a little bit about your website. If folks go out to your website, it's I've got it right here. It's startswithme.ca, right?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
What will they find? What kind of resources are on your website?
Yeah, thanks. I think my somewhat scattered mind, there's a fair bit there. I'd say where, if in specific response to the question around the self-identification and some of the story and this experience, I'd say the YouTube, there's a fair bit of stuff on YouTube that I have, and you can get there through the website. But we have, so I have a podcast as well. Talk a lot similar to this conversation we're having right now, which is why it's so nice to be on this side. And I thank you again for that. Podcasts, videos, there's some pretty good blogs. They're not super long, but one of my colleagues has written a few of them. He writes a little more academically than I do, but there's blogs. And I'd say if you're a teacher, we just partnered with an amazing organization in the US actually called the Log Off Movement. They're a bunch of students who are trying to help kids get off social media. So we have a lot of stuff for schools and teachers. And then in workplace, we do mental health consulting in the workplace with lunch and learns and sort of extended consulting practices where we help companies integrate a mental health strategy, which there isn't robust research, although enough of it shows that if you take care of people and they're happy at work, they tend to produce more and be productive, which leads to more profits, and you're not paying as much money in disability costs and short-term leave and this and that. And so, whoa, my screaming upstairs. So yes, I think that kind of answers the question a bit.
Okay.
So that's
your website. They'll find your resources to YouTube, post different things like that.
Yeah.
Well, Mike, it's been a pleasure having you on. I certainly appreciate you telling your story, sharing your story with this audience. I'm glad that you found your way, because I think you're doing really great work now. And so all of that past history wasn't for nothing. Something great came out of it. And that's, I always tell folks, go out and do amazing things. And your work with especially the younger generation, I think that's so important. Like high school, junior high, there needs to be more awareness around mental health, especially in today's society where we're all connected. So I appreciate what you're doing. It's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Brian, thank you again. And right back at you in terms of just having these conversations is beautiful and soothing, cathartic. And the more of them that we have, I think the more people will hopefully find their way through their own darkness and start to enjoy their lives. Or I love what you said earlier, giving ourselves permission. I think that's what you said. It was so nice to hear that and be reminded of that. And give yourself permission out there.
Starts with you.
There you go.
And let's give your podcast a little love too. Go ahead and shout that out. Where can they find your podcast?
So you can find it on the website, but it's the State of Mind Mental Health Podcast. And as far as I know, it's on Apple, Spotify. I'm pretty sure it's on the other things if Libsyn is pushing it out there the way it's supposed to.
It should be everywhere.
I hope so. I'm not good at that side of it either, but the podcast is cool. And Brian, I hope we can switch positions at some point, and I'll have you on one of these days.
Yeah, I'd love to. Anything I can do to put my story out there, and just hopefully, what I've gone through, that's all I could hope for is that somebody will hear it and know that they're not alone. Nobody's alone in any of these struggles. There's so many of us out there that can relate, can help. you just got to reach out. And so that's, I think, the most important thing. But
yeah.
Well, hang tight. I want to have a quick chat with you once we stop recording, but I hope to talk again soon.
Likewise. All right. Thanks a lot. Take it easy.
All right.